And I just want to say a great word of welcome to anyone who is joining us at this point in the day. People are flowing in and out, and if you see people around you that you didn't see this morning, be sure to turn around and say hello to them as they join us for this afternoon. We're good on housekeeping. Great. Then we are going to start, and I'm going to get to say 2 words of framing. I'm Aliza Mazor. I am the Chief Field Building Officer at Upstart. Upstart works with bold leaders and new ideas in the Jewish community to help them get off the ground. If anyone's interested in Upstart, I have cards out in the lobby, and you can reach out to me after this convening, and I'm happy to share more about what Upstart does. It has been Upstart's true pleasure to be part of Footsteps' journey as an organization from the very beginning. And I'm not going to say too much about that, except to say that this morning, as we opened the day and went through the first sessions of the day, I was really struck and moved by how much has happened in this universe since the founding of Footsteps. And I just want to say that from someone who was there at the beginning, when it was Malki, and Malki was still a student here at Hunter and was trying to figure out what to do with all the people she'd met and gathered that had a similar story to hers, and all the things and needs she wanted to try to meet. And it was really the germ of an idea. And now today, not only is Footsteps a flourishing organization, but Footsteps has international colleagues to bring into a conversation. On this morning's panel, we heard so many exciting entrepreneurial ideas and ventures that have been spun out of Footsteps and have come out of the Footsteps community, answering additional needs and creating new opportunities. And I was also struck by this morning's, the second panel that I went to, with the social workers, to see 3 generations of clinical staff at Footsteps. And from someone who was there before Michael Jenkins was even hired, it is exciting to say there is now a field of practitioners that have done this work and know this work and have built the practice around this work. And on this panel, in this next 90 minutes-ish, we are going to focus on the international scene and understanding where there are organizations that do work similar to Footsteps around the globe and what those organizations do, and the beginning of, dare I say, a field, a movement, momentum around deeper collaboration among all the players doing this work in lots of different places. So, without further ado, I'm going to ask each of our panelists to take 2 minutes. In those 2 minutes, you are going to introduce yourself and say a little bit about how you ended up doing the work that you're doing, a little bit about your organization, how long it's been around, and a little bit of who it serves and what it does in the world. And we're going to start with Avi, and we're all going to be very kind to Avi, who's got a bit of a hoarse throat, and listen very carefully so that he doesn't have to strain his voice.
Thank you, and just thank you to all of you here. It's so really beautiful to be here, because I think for most of us, we oftentimes are so in our own space. So to be with the international community of Yotzim is really special. Hillel's story began 30 years ago, relatively, in 1991, when Shai Horowitz, at the age of 17, was a young Yotze who appeared on national television in Israel and expressed his dream of an organization that would support those in the process of Yetziah. Now, I should note that Shai himself eventually returned to the Haredi world, which was very publicly reported on in Israel. But when he appeared on television, he was seen by a couple named Tammy and Mickey Cohen. And Tammy and Mickey Cohen were part of the movement for humanistic Judaism in Israel at that time. And they were very touched by his story, and they really came to believe that secular Jews in Israel had a real responsibility to provide support for those who are leaving the ultra-Orthodox community. And they in turn turned to someone called Rafi Shapira, who was from the Shomer HaTzair kibbutz movement in Israel. And they started interacting with the Yotzim who were coming out of the Haredi community and absorbing them into the kibbutz movement and finding them home spaces in the kibbutz and providing programming and support there. The organization grew as the population of Yotzim grew and this core of volunteers grew. And I should note here as well that our organization from 1991 until 2013 was entirely a volunteer organization. Meaning there were no paid employees in the organization in 2013. Our current director, Yair Haas, who couldn't be here today, began as a volunteer in 2017, and then only came into a paid position in 2013. He was one of the first paid employees. And what happened is that Hillel realized that relying on the kibbutz movement for space wasn't working anymore. We were growing in terms of population. So we had a small apartment in Tel Aviv, which became a space where Yotzim could come and go. They had to come and go discreetly. And the only way they could know about it is by the organization posting bumper stickers with the hotline number for Hillel in train stations and bus stations throughout Israel. Eventually, we also opened a small apartment in Jerusalem. And today we have 4 centers nationwide. We have a center in Jerusalem, one in Tel Aviv, one in Haifa, and we just opened in Sfat at the end of 2019. We have an emergency shelter facility, which is a residential facility, and we have transitional housing in Tel Aviv, in Jerusalem, and we provide a fairly comprehensive array of services and programs for Yotzim in Israel. I myself came to the organization in 2015. I'd been working since 2002, Yachasit, in the third sector, the nonprofit sector in Israel. And at the time, I myself was moving from a more Orthodox orientation to a more open orientation. And I had a meeting with Yair Haas and really clicked. And I think that the ikar for me, the central thing there that really struck me is the human story of what it is to move through the world. We all have made lateral shifts, right? We've all gone from one social grouping to another, and a lot of us take it for granted that we can do that with a minimum of fuss and bother, and we can decide who we want to be and move through the world that way. And I think that there's something about not being willing to live in contradiction and to make that kind of shift, but to know that your choice has huge consequences, and to make that choice anyway, and then to really live that and be responsible to that.
Great, thank you, Avi. And now, Leah Boulton from Pathways in Australia.
Thank you. I think you said we have 2 minutes, but my note said 3.
Also, can we define Yotzim? Just like, let's not assume that people understand language.
In Israel, the term Yotzim comes from Yotzim b'sheila, because when someone is secular and becomes religious, so they're chozer b'tshuva, right? So they're returning to the answer, so to speak. Yotzim b'sheila are people who leave to question. So that's sort of the colloquial term for OTD in Israel is Yotzim.
My name's Leah Boulton. I'm from Melbourne, Australia, where we play the Australian Open tennis. Starting Pathways Melbourne 4 years ago was, I guess, a personal passion for me. But until that point, I had no idea that this would become my life purpose. I was raised as a secular humanist Jew at home. My parents both consider themselves atheists. My mother was a Holocaust, she came out post-Holocaust at age 2 from Czech Republic, and my father is Jewish but from New Zealand, very small community. I was raised with extensive overseas travel, the arts, the sciences. I was a tomboy, loved playing sport. I was the son my dad never had, and I was given the opportunity to do whatever I wanted in life. Conversely, though, they sent me to a modern Orthodox school. The options for progressive weren't really there, and they wanted me to have a sense of Jewish community, which I definitely have. But so I had a wonderful secular education, but I spent a very disproportionate time of my childhood learning Talmud, Hebrew, ancient Hebrew, Jewish values, Jewish studies, the whole works. I've always felt outside the mainstream Jewish community back home. The mainstream Zionistic Jewish community, which was the school that I went to. One of my close Jewish friends from school became Haredi, and we reconnected about 11 years ago. And she invites me to all her simchas, and I go fully frummed up, I frump up, I cover up, and I've come to know a lot of the women in the community, and I love that nothing more. I'm very neutral. I have full respect for people who feel that is their truth. But as we all know, and the reason why we're all here is that in any community, some people just don't fit in. And it was at a wedding in 2014 where I met a young Hasidic woman. She approached me and she knew that I was from the outside but didn't quite know where I fit in, because I do look frum when I go to these things. And she shared with me that she wanted to go rollerblading, she wanted to go to university, and she didn't want to have to remarry again when she had been married for 3 months, and now she was back living at home again, still wearing a wig, sharing a bedroom with a 15-year-old and 3-year-old sibling. And I left that wedding with a massive migraine, and I knew about Footsteps, and I asked her permission to, I said, look, I'm not suggesting that you're wanting to move away from ultra-Orthodoxy, but I know of this organisation in New York. Can I reach out to them? Maybe they can talk to you, because I did not have the capacity, I did not have the right to counsel her. She said yes. I contacted Footsteps, and they did not have the capacity to deal with anyone outside of New York. That was in 2014. So that became my determination then to read anything and everything about joining fundamentalist religion, leaving fundamentalist religion, but I was determined to start something in Melbourne because I really identified the need for not feeling alone, just sense of community. I wanted to create a new community, and it just drove me. So that's all I read now, is about joining and leaving cults and things. Inspired by Footsteps, I guess this is where we are today. And look, with that young woman, she started babysitting my daughter. That felt like the kosher way of having a relationship with her. She ultimately decided to stay within her community, and she got married 2 years ago to a ger man in London, and she had me down on her CV as a reference. Unfortunately, the shadchan never called me because I wanted to speak to the shadchan about her want for rollerblading, but she's very happy and she's had 2 kids, and I went to a wedding and the whole bit. So we are not about, Pathways is not about pulling anyone away from Orthodoxy. It's about helping people to lead self-determined lives. I'll talk more about what our organisation does later, but that's how I got into this. Oh, can I just say one more thing? Sorry. I have not done this alone. I met a young man, he's in his 50s, but he's young, who actually Footsteps introduced us. He, in 2015, contacted Footsteps to commend them on their work. He was ex-Mizrahi. He calls himself OTD Light. And Footsteps put us in touch. And we had a couple of coffees, and I said, Mark, his name's Mark Cherney, I said, Mark, I want to start this, will you do it with me? And I didn't know enough people in the mainstream Jewish community, but he knew the people, and so we started it together, and now we've got a full board and the full thing. So, yeah, that's what happened.
Thank you, Leah. And now, Linda Turner of Mavar in the United Kingdom.
Okay, thank you. Hello, everyone. Before I start, I just want to thank Lani and her team for inviting me over from London to learn and share my story and learn from all of you. So thank you. Mavar's story is not dissimilar to Leah's, or my story isn't that different. I'm also the co-founder and the director of Mavar. I also came from a very secular background, knew nothing really of the world of Haredim and those wanting to leave, other than the fact that my father was born in Belz in Poland and was a little Belz Chassid as a very young child, but we had a very secular upbringing, and I really knew nothing. And my journey started when I went to Limud. I was a regular attender at Limud, and I heard a really interesting talk at Limud. Oh, okay. So Limud was started in Britain, actually. They used to call themselves a conference. It's now, I think, they call themselves a festival. It's a coming together. It was originally coming together once a year around the time of Christmas of people who wanted to learn from each other. They were educators, they were artists, they were a complete complete interfaith, if you like, a range of Jews across London. And it's grown into a massive international network. And now in London, when we have our main conference, well, it's not in London, actually, it's universities around the country, there's about 2,500 people who attend. And we learn from each other. So I attended Limud, and there was a talk by two young men who had left ultra-Orthodoxy. They called the session Secrets from the Shtetl. And of course, lots of people wanted to go because people want to know about secrets and they want to know about closed worlds, and it was a very vibrant session. During that, they shared their personal stories, and during their talk, they kept using the word trapped. And that was like the push button for me. I just, I'm one of these people, I believe in social justice and human rights, and I just felt concerned about what they were sharing and telling us. And like a lot of people after their session, I went up to the guys afterwards and I said, can we talk? And maybe there should be a sort of Jewish child line. I mean, it was just a kind of conversation. And it was one of those strange scenarios where one conversation led to the next, and it became a runaway train, and before I knew it, I was setting up a charity. And actually, I already had a job. It's like I didn't really need to be doing it, because it's a huge undertaking, as I'm sure you appreciate. I was working in the creative arts in London. I ran theatre education projects for many, many years. So I knew about project management, and I knew about bringing people together. But I certainly didn't know very much about the Haredi world and the needs of people, Yotzim and others. And so my role, I felt initially, was to bring together, I spent a year actually, before Mavar. This started in, I should say, 2012. And it took me a year to put together a board of management, a group of mentors who we were going to train, resources, policies, value system, our mission. We really thought about it. We spent a long time doing that. And our plan was to piggyback existing services. I didn't want to recreate the massive amount of work that was already going on in London. We have Jewish Women's Aid, we have Jewish employment organizations. I didn't want to recreate that. I just wanted to piggyback it so that we could signpost people who would come to us. I have to say I had never heard of Footsteps, I had never heard of Hillel, I didn't know about any organizations. As we have with us today Robert from Gesher, which was an organization, Gesher EU, I should say, set up a similar time to a little bit before Mavar. I hadn't heard of them. But I was on a mission. I felt this was something that needed to be done. And so that, I guess, was our story. And I should just say that one of the things I felt was an important aspect of what we wanted to do was to enable people to come to a space where they had a non-judgmental, professional, confidential space to share their stories. We were very, very clear about the fact that this was not we were not an organization that was going to be in any way campaigning. We're not an activist group. We try very hard to remain neutral so that people know they can come to us and we're not there to do anything other than represent them.
Great. Thank you, Linda. Lani. Footsteps, our convener and host for this gathering. Tell us a little bit about Footsteps.
Sure, I'll speak to the founding story and how I got involved. So Footsteps was started right here at Hunter College. Where's Malki? Is she here? She will not out herself ever. Okay, if she's here, she's hiding. We wouldn't be here today. None of us would be here today. Well, Hillel might be here today, but they wouldn't be physically in this room without Malki Schwartz. And so a huge, yeah. And so when Malki, who grew up in Crown Heights, began to have questions about whether this was, she wanted to go down the path that was determined for her of, work a little but really get married and start to have kids, and she had wanted to pursue her educational journey, and her parents were not supportive of that. She reached out to some secular relatives, some of whom are here in this room today, Deborah. And she and her grandmother, Judith, helped Deborah, Judith, and other family helped to support Malki in that journey of first fighting tooth and nail to get her high school transcripts released so that she could attend college, and then help her get into Hunter and have housing to attend. And Malki, once she was here, met some other folks who were on similar journeys, some of whom came from different religious communities, they wondered to themselves why there were no supports out there for people who were leaving insular religious communities. Malki knew that she was fortunate enough to have some secular relatives, but that was not the norm for people that she knew. And Footsteps was really founded to be that family for people and that support for people that didn't have it otherwise. And so that is Footsteps' founding story. What started as a fledgling support group here at Hunter College has become a flourishing organization, and I'll speak a little bit to our program model afterwards, but I'll say that for me, I could not have predicted, having come out of college really, knowing that I was invested in social justice and human rights work, landing in this position. When Aliza called me, actually, saying, "Oh, have you heard of this organization?" We sat on a board together, and I was thinking about my next steps career-wise. I couldn't have predicted what an amazing fit it would be. For me, I grew up modern Orthodox in a family that was, relatively open. I have activist grandparents on both sides, and both of my parents became religious in college. I have seeker here. I believe I'm from a family of seekers, and I myself am a seeker. And they landed themselves in a community that was much more sort of closed than they expected, I think. And there was a lot of warmth and love in that community. And there were a lot of challenges for us as a family that was different. Even when we were living in it, we were the only family that shipped out to another neighborhood to go to a co-ed modern Orthodox day school, for instance. Or my mom stopped covering her hair wearing pants. So we were always a little out of place in the community that we grew up in. And and actually my mom is here today, so you could credit her with my being here, because I don't think I would have really identified in my heart as much with Footsteps if I hadn't had the experience of feeling so alone when she came out as gay. And back then, modern Orthodox communities were not as open as they are today around that issue. And a lot of change has happened in modern Orthodox spaces around being more accepting of people with different sexual orientations. But back then, I was afraid of being excommunicated. And to feel, literally, I thought I would be thrown out of my school. And that ability to identify with feeling so alone and isolated, for me, led me on a path to support people, to find my own sense of self in the world. And career-wise, I knew I wanted to support people in leading authentic lives. And I sought out my own communities that could support me. And so doing so, the combination at Footsteps of supporting people to be their true selves in accepting non-judgmental, safe communities, and on top of that, helping people access what is rightly theirs in terms of the human rights and social justice work that we do has been a huge honor. So 10 years later, I couldn't have predicted where I was.
Great. Thank you, Lani. So the way this is going to work is we've got a few questions for this panel that we're going to ask them, and then we're going to open it up for your questions as we've done in previous sessions. So think now if you have questions. Do we want people to still use the cards? think now if you have questions. If you have them, start writing them down on cards, and we'll collect them when we get further into the conversation. But I'd now like to give each of our panelists an opportunity to speak a little bit more in detail about their organization and the work that it does. And specifically, I'd like you to talk about first how large you believe or understand the population of people that are exploring or considering or wanting to lead self-determined lives who are inside of insular community, of the insular or ultra-Orthodox communities in your country. So first give us your little guesstimate of how large this group might be. And I just want to say as a footnote, one of my very early conversations with Malki when she was in the process of founding Footsteps, she was sitting in my office and I said, Malki, how many people do you think there might be out there that are like you? And she said, a couple hundred maybe? And I think the evidence in this room today and the evidence of the work that Footsteps does in the United States says that that was a very low estimate, and the numbers are much larger. And so I'd like you each to talk a little bit about what you think the scope is inside of your country. I'd also like you to say a little more about the services and programs you offer. And lastly, I'd like you to talk about the fact each of you mentioned that you're not campaigning, that you're not trying to recruit people. So you're kind of, in many ways, different ways, flying low on a radar. And how do people then find you if you're not out there in a very public way? So I'm actually on this one going to start with Linda, and then we'll work our way from the inside to the outside.
Okay. Well, in terms of numbers, I mean, the UK community is approximate. People say anything between 45 to 55,000. Of course, the numbers are not clear. We have a large community in London, mostly Stamford Hill, also Golders Green, and I'm talking about ultra-Orthodox, the ultra-Orthodox community, absolutely. And then Manchester, we think there's around, so in London we think there's around maybe 35,000, something like that, ultra-Orthodox. Manchester maybe 10,000, and a couple of thousand in Gateshead. But if you were to ask me then, how many of those people do we think might be thinking about changing their way of life? And I'm asked this question a lot. My answer is, how could anyone possibly know what is in the hearts and minds of people who are not allowed to express themselves? I mean, I feel it's an impossible question to answer. And my sense from the people who come to us is probably quite a lot, but they don't know. One of the young men who was actually from Israel, who kind of came to support Mavar, said that he reckoned it was about a third of the community were quite comfortable where they're at, what they're doing, their lifestyle. He reckoned a third were not comfortable but would never do anything about it, and about a third would do something about it if they felt they had the support. And that's a really broad brushstroke, but I don't know I'd be interested to hear whether you think that's something similar. In terms of the services, so I again want to flag up Gesher EU because, in a sense, I think what happens in London is, in terms of relationship to Footsteps in America, is that we've kind of divided out some of the services we offer. So Gesher EU describes themselves, and Robert, correct me if I'm wrong, although we've talked about this, as a community of support. I often refer to them as a sort of surrogate family. And they do all the social activities. They have meetups once a week, once a fortnight, once a week. They have residentials away a couple of times a year. They also offer some support in terms of legal assistance, not the financial side, but they can do a certain amount of referring on to mediators and lawyers, and I think they do like to specialize in that area. Mavar takes a very different approach. The core function of Mavar is to offer everyone who comes to us a mentor. And that person is usually someone from a professional background who stays very closely aligned with us. We do regular training. And from the mentor come all the other services. So outside of that core team, we have counsellors and tutors, employment, education specialists, I'm sure all the things that you have, legal specialists, immigration specialists. So there's a whole team of specialists, some of whom may be doing something once a week and some possibly once a year. It's a very erratic group, but they're there, and I'm very grateful for that professional support because that's not my background. So we'd like to think of ourselves as offering one-to-one, bespoke, confidential, practical support. And that will cover everything through from education, which at least half the people who come to us want to catch up their education, employment, they want to put a roof over their head, they want to know... I don't have to tell you all the things that people need and want. And we had avoided the social side because of the existence of Gesher EU, but we actually this year are going to do a big push in a different way. Rather than Mavar having meetups and drop-ins and things where people are coming together as a community, we feel our role is to help people to integrate socially and culturally with the wider world. So again, our social responsibility, we feel, has to be bespoke. It's about what does an individual need and want. It's not a one-fit-all thing. It's not about all come together and let's all go off to the cinema. It's about what do you need, what would you like, and how can we find your interest and help to kind of integrate you into the wider world. So that's how we see our function. And there was a third question. I'm sorry, what was the third one?
You fly low under the radar, but how do people find you?
Oh, how do people find us? So that's one of our biggest challenges. Obviously, it's mostly word of mouth, and it's, of course, social media. But it's hard. And actually, a lot of people say they're looking for an organisation and they don't easily find us. And we need to do a lot more work on that front.
Okay, thank you, Linda. Leah.
So firstly, I thought I'd just tell you that we've got 22.5 million people. Is this working? 22.5 million people in Australia. That's our population. I checked up last night how many Jews we've got. I got 3 different answers. So according to the 2016 census, there were, well, it could be between 92,500, this is Australia-wide, to over 113,000. But we think that there's more, and people just don't write down Jewish on the census. But we're sort of thinking around 0.43% of our Australian population is Jewish. And the bulk of the Jewry is between Melbourne and Sydney. The larger community is actually in Melbourne. And the local population, we have got the largest post-Holocaust community in the world outside of Israel. So fairly conservative overall, but the Holocaust plays a big cultural aspect of our lives. How big's our Yotzim kind of populate? Well, I don't know. We've got 40 on our books. But we've only been really in people's minds in the last couple of years. So we're pretty proud of that. As far as, actually I should have said how many, so if I was to say how many non-Lubavitch Hasidish have we got? And that's lumping together Satmar, which is increasing back home, Satmar, Breslev, Belz, so all mixed together. We think maybe about 250 families, but when they've got an average of 8 to 14, I know one family with 18 kids, you know, what's the community? It's hard for us to say, really. And as far as Chabad, there's a large community. I mean, they're big everywhere, but there is a large community. So Pathways is the only organisation in Australia that does this kind of work. There is a drop-in centre in Melbourne called Aliza, and it's Chabad, and it's for young guys, not women, but guys to go. It's the guys that wear jeans to shul or turn up late. They go shoot some pool, but it's about trying to bring them back in. So but they've got, when we met about 2 years ago, they had about 100 guys on their books. But I believe that there are a lot that leave. If I just compared the community in Australia to my understanding of New York, let's say. So in New York, you've got suburbs of ultra-Orthodox Jews where they don't speak English. They don't have to meet anyone that isn't of them. Where I'm from, we have got an area that we call the ghetto, but there would be an ultra-Orthodox person living next to a modern Orthodox person, living next to me, living next to an Asian person, right? So it's mixed, but very much predominantly Jewish, but ultra-Orthodox, and because they need to live near their shuls. I just want to give you a bit of a perspective on what it's like. And yes, it is summer back home, and yes, the water goes down the drain the other way. Like, that's the other thing.
Let's hold what our communities are like for a little bit.
Okay, fine.
You just want to say, how do people find you?
Okay, so word of mouth, online, but we do a lot of PR talking to shuls. We go around to shuls. of all time. Well, actually, Ari Hershkovitz came out 2 years ago. We brought 2018. We brought Ari out for Limud Oz, and we did the speaking circuit together, all to raise awareness. We do a lot of that stuff. My background's actually in marketing and PR, so we do a lot of that and speaking to the mainstream Jews, because if they know somebody, then they can talk to somebody who knows somebody, and that's how we get in, word of mouth. We also haven't done enough work this way, but we try to get in with medical professionals, so with GPs or fertility specialists, where people may confide in somebody Jewish or not Jewish and say, look, I'm really struggling. So that's another way. We also leave bookmarks in the library in books that might be related to this kind of stuff. We have a lot of guerrilla marketing. We have some sheets in the local supermarkets with little tear-offs with, confidential phone number to call. Invariably, they go up on the wall and they come down the next day. Someone they just all go, or all the they're just all gone. So so in the local areas, we put stuff. So that's how we get our word out.
Great. Lani.
Do you want us to include our program model in this?
Yes.
Okay. I'll try to cover all the things. So starting with the demographics, the latest study that was done, we finally had a demographic study done after years of wanting it done by a sociologist named Mark Trencher, a statistician, who did work in 2015, 2016, and then updated it for us in 2017. So the latest population estimate for the ultra-Orthodox community in the United States is just above 600,000 individuals. And of that, just below 550,000 live in the New York metro area. This research I just want to name, combined with the fact that we were so pleased to see Freedom emerging on the national landscape, for us, helped us with the decision in our last strategic plan to stay focused in the New York metro area largely, and assist and provide assistance to groups and individuals who are coming to us globally and across North America. So we just felt like, yes, people have been coming to us over the years to ask for support and advice in other locations, a couple of whom are sitting on this panel. For us to stay focused, the amount of work there is right here in the New York metro area, which includes New Jersey, and up in Rockland and Orange counties, just continues to feel immense. So that's where we focus most of our energies. In the same study that Mark Trencher did, he did an estimate for us of 100,000 people who have left or are considering leaving soon, ultra-Orthodox communities. We have not updated that in a few years. Footsteps has directly served over the years 1,700 individuals. We weren't counting as well in the early years since it's harder to count beans early on organizationally, so that's an estimate. We were founded in 2004. And we also estimate that there's a much bigger network, of individuals who are connected with organizations and who are not connected with organizations, who are in secret Facebook groups. That network we're estimating at around 6,000 individuals who have left communities and are looking to connect with each other. In terms of the program model, the way that we think about it is there's a series of needs that you'll hear all of us talking about, and approach it in different ways, right? There's the social isolation and the real importance of social and communal support that we all figure out how to do, right? Building that sense of belonging is so vital, toggled with that sense of self. How do you have a sense of self and a sense of belonging together? So that community in one edge of the triangle, the supportive services largely focused on individual one-to-one work, but within that, and then there's another piece around activism that I think we all toggle through and figure out. The way that Footsteps has approached this is that we feel strongly that people come for community and stay for services. And so those two should really be intertwined. We'll find people who are years out who want to come back and offer help. You've heard some people talk about that today and say, I came back to offer help, and then I had a need and Footsteps was there for me. Or we have people who come because they're so isolated and they just want to understand that peers are there for them. And that's really why they're walking through the doors. And then they're so pleased to know that we have a whole line of practical services that we offer, which include educational, career guidance, scholarships. We give over $500,000 in scholarships away annually. Mental health, as you heard earlier, legal supports is a growing area. All of this is based on key partnerships. It is so vital. We do not do this work alone. We're not looking to replicate the work. That combined, those services combined with community, large social events, retreats. We have second-gen programming. So people who are leaving with kids want family programming. And so we make that happen. And so much of this is based on seasoned members giving back as well as volunteers. And we recently have stepped into more awareness raising and movement building work, including being a spokesperson for media, supporting other grassroots efforts through Ignite microgrants, through mentorship. And this convening is a huge step in the direction of the field and movement building that we've wanted to be doing for a long time. The outreach question is tricky, and it's interesting. We've done much less guerrilla marketing over the years. Although we have felt more comfortable coming out and saying, right, like, yes, we're here. We're not convincing people to leave, but we want to make sure that everyone who has a need to lead a self-determined life and is not able to do that in an ultra-Orthodox community can do that. It's largely word of mouth. We have a lot of work to do to myth bust, which is where the community mostly gets us. We could have a whole long conversation about that, but I'll stop there.
Right. And Avi, what is probably the largest ultra-Orthodox community in the world?
It is, but it's interesting because it's not really so different than in the States and when you really deal with the numbers. But right now, in 2018, the Haredi community in Israel reached 1 million. And there's been a couple different studies done on the Yotzei population and what's happening in terms of the shifting in religious allegiances within the Israeli population. The first was done in 2016 by the Shoresh Institute, and there they projected that around 6% are leaving the Haredi community each year, but there were some questions in terms of the sample size they used. So in 2018, actually the Central Bureau of Statistics in Israel revisited this question and sort of asked people, what's the household you grew up in and where do you hold now? And there they estimate that the numbers are around 12% within the age range of 20 to 24 were leaving each year. And they said that's the age range in which people are leaving the fastest, but that regardless, the number of people leaving each year is growing. Also in 2018, there was a study done by Nir Horowitz, and this was in conjunction with an organization called Yotzim L'Shinui, and funded by the Schusterman Foundation. The estimate there was 8 to 10%. Most recently, there's a 2019 study done by the Israel Democracy Institute, and there the preliminary findings, because they're not out yet fully, but some of them were published in Haaretz pretty recently, was 16 to 18% leaving. So I can't tell you how many are leaving. I can tell you there's a lot of them. What I can tell you is that at Hillel we've seen intake increasing every year over the last 5 years by on average 20%. And also the demographic is shifting. 10 years ago, it would have been mostly, people within the age range of 18 to 21 and whatever it is. Now we are seeing from 18 to 51 in terms of people who are serving at the organization. I should say we only serve those 18 and over because we, as of 2015, work in a joint agreement with the Ministry of Welfare in Israel. So we get some funding from the ministry, and therefore we only deal with an adult population. There's also been a marked increase in the number of women coming to Hillel over the last couple of years. Traditionally, the breakdown had been about 30% women 70% men, and obviously there's issues there in terms of mobility of women in the public sphere in the Haredi community, difference in the ages at which men and women get married in the community and therefore get tied into a much more difficult situation in terms of leaving. But for example, in 2018 we saw 45% leave, and 45% of our new intake were women. In 2019 the numbers aren't quite in yet, but like around 43%. So that's definitely a trend that we think that's going forward. In terms of the services we provide, so first of all, we have, as I said, the 4 centers, and at those we provide counseling, probably around 5,000 hours of counseling a year, give or take. And at those centers as well, we have about 700 different events, workshops, and so forth that go on every year. We also focus a lot on housing security, so we have transitional apartments in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv where participants can live rent-free for up to 1 year, and there's counseling services and social workers that are connected to the apartments. And then for single-parent participants, we have right now 190 single parents with 369 children in programming. So since our shared housing is not suitable for those participants, so they receive housing subsidies, monthly housing subsidies for up to 3 years. Education and employment services, we provide a wide range there. Our scholarships program in 2019 did about 2,200,000 shekels in scholarships, so 344 scholarships. And so far applications for the next academic year are up to past 400. And then we provide a wide range of tutoring services. I should mention, by the way, that we have about 32 staff members right now, social work staff and other staff. But we also have a volunteer base in Israel of 700 volunteers at this point. So they provide a lot in terms of helping us, for example, tutoring services, personal mentoring services. A lot of them are psychologists themselves or social workers or educators, and that's really helpful. Sorry, I'm just trying to pack a lot into a little space, a little bit of time. But again, volunteer personal mentorship, that's something that we also engage. And we have, of course, Habayit Shel Hillel, which is our emergency shelter facility. That's a residential facility that can house 6 men and 6 women for up to 4 months at a time. And that's our most vulnerable participants. One of the things that's special about the facility is that in Israel, in most shelter facilities, you cannot do emergency intake, generally speaking, for the population in this age range. You would have to, in order to do intake into a shelter, you would have to, either prove homelessness for a 6-month period or go through a psychiatric evaluation. But because of our agreement with the Ministry of Welfare, we're able to do emergency intake on the spot in certain cases, which is, I think, crucial for this population. We also have a program that supports Yotzim who are entering into the IDF and to national service. We get them lone soldier status. We also have an apartment where they can be when they're off duty, and we provide certain subsidies. And community building. At the end of the day, it's nice to provide services, and the programs are really important. But the most important thing really happening, I think, is that the Yotzim in Israel are really an emerging demographic. They're a piece of the Israeli social fabric that's never existed before, that's now coming into existence. And we'll talk a little bit later, I think, in some of the other questions about what that means, because I think that people are really unwilling at this point to separate them from the Haredi question in Israel. And no, these people have left that community. They're no longer part of the Haredi question. They're their own question. There's more questions than answers, but we're trying to find some answers. There was the last part in terms of outreach. We also don't do any kind of outreach directly in the Haredi community, meaning we feel like this is such a large decision with so many consequences, so being a catalyst for that kind of decision making is problematic on some level. At the same time, Hillel's been around for a long time, and at this point in Israel, everybody has a cousin, brother, sister's cousin's brother who's left the community, and if so, they've come through Hillel. And Hillel is also the monster under the bed in the Haredi community. If you get into a car with someone from Hillel, when you're hitchhiking, they'll whisk you away, they'll bring you to a room, they'll get you with a woman alone, they'll record you, they'll make sure you can, you're laughing, but this is firsthand what I've heard from people, who this is how they first heard of Hillel, and that's not a service we provide. But we generally rely on word of mouth. At this point also, our community of Yotzim has their own social media presence, and of course the first thing somebody's doing when they're thinking about leaving is they're accessing social media and the internet and trying to see what's out there. And we are, in 2020, moving forward, starting to move into we're doing a lot more advocacy work now in the last, let's say, 6 months and into the future. So that plays into how we'll be approaching this issue. And thankfully, in the last 2 to 3 years, Hillel has gotten a lot of press in Israel, and so that just helps, put us into the public sphere more and more.
Great. I'm going to give one more set question to the panel, and I know some of my panelists have things they neglected to mention that they want to mention, so you can do this on the next round. And then we're going to open it up for you. So if you have questions, write them down. Molly, who's going to circulate to grab them? Can I? Okay, Molly's going to make sure someone is going to circulate and grab your questions. So think about them. And I want each panelist to briefly hit on what do you see as the unmet needs right now? If you had more resources, what would you do? What would you add? What would you do differently? And what do you see as some of the challenges and opportunities in the work that you do? We're going to do that as the last go-round, and then we'll be opening it up for the audience's questions. And I'll take anyone who's ready. Unmet needs, challenges, opportunities, and anything you forgot to say.
Okay, what I forgot to say was actually what we provide. So what we provide is a confidential first port of call for people considering making a change or just wanting to question. We have peer-to-peer support for our network, and we call your footsteppers, we have pathfinders. We have monthly meetups, and we even actually had one with the ultra-Orthodox Jews with the ex-Jehovah's Witnesses, and we're wanting to do a lot more of that, linking the ex-culture, communities. We do social events, bushwalks, films. We're thinking of starting a book club, actually. And then we have referral services as required. So for emergency housing, we've got partnerships with emergency housing, food assistance, higher education. And then we do a lot of community education and advocacy work. As I said, we bring out an international speaker each year. So we had Ari Hershkovitz a couple of years ago. We had Abby Stein last year, and we're looking for someone this year. Okay, what was the next? We're volunteer run. So that actually is really tough for us. We do have, we're getting funding from, mainly from philanthropic trusts. We have one great anonymous supporter as well, private, but we're really volunteer run, and that's our biggest challenge because there's so much work for us to do that we want to do. We just ran a huge survey of our community, and the things that people would love is actually they want us to work with their families. And we're all workshopping tomorrow, our organisations, but I want to hear if the other organisations do much in that area, because our community of Yotzim want us to work with their parents and their siblings. What else did you want me to talk about?
Challenges and opportunities.
All right, challenges is capacity, because we're only young as an organisation. Our board is a working committee. They're amazing, but we've all got our own day jobs. Challenges also, I would say, is within our community of Pathfinders, we have a DAS, or our Haredi community. We actually haven't got any Satmar, although Satmar is growing. And in fact, they've got a school where they only do 45 minutes of English a day. I spent my whole flight with a Satmar couple. It was a closed, cabin, so I made sure I spoke to them for a lot. And they've just moved their kids to Satmar, and I asked them why, and they said because they only teach 45 minutes of English, maybe 3 times a week. The other school does 3 hours a day. So I love speaking to people from the ultra-frum community, and because I'm neutral, I don't have that background. I'm not intimidated, and I'm curious. And because of that, they talk and we share ideas. And I think that can actually promote change. Whether I'm going to change them completely, no. But if I can change 1 or 2 or 5, The other challenge for us is we're a small community. So at our meetups, you know, for instance, we had a meetup where halfway through, a guy, you know, and a woman, you know, they winked at each other and they said, "Should we tell the rest?" And everyone went, "What?" So one of them used to be married, so that they each used to be married to one another's brother and sister. So his ex-wife was her ex-husband's brother, sister. And we get a lot of that stuff. So anonymity is so important, and I believe our group respects that. But man, they all know each other's family. You know, everyone knows each other. We also had one situation where, and this was the only session I wasn't in because I actually facilitate the group. I was away, where a new woman came and her husband came, and I knew him, and had I been there, I would have realised that he was there really only to control his wife, because he was still absolutely from. And within the meetup, he started accusing other people. "I know your mother, and I'm going to talk to her about this." Or, "I know your," and I've probably moved into something else, which is the pros and cons of being someone who is X and someone who isn't. We can talk about that later.
We may not have time for everything, and I do want the audience's questions.
Right,
so if you can wrap and...
Okay. Yeah, so look, are our needs being met? No, we haven't got enough capacity, but we're doing a bloody good job with what we've got, and we really are creating a new community, and we're really being known as a household name within our broader community, so that's great. And one of us, your film, has helped us to no end, because I go around showing that at different shuls of all denominations. And, you know, often people say, you know, "What do you do?" And I say, "Well, do you know Footsteps? Have you seen that film on Netflix?" And they say, "Yeah, well, that's what we do." And it's really, yeah.
Who else wants to talk about unmet needs, gaps, challenges, and opportunities? Lani.
Unmet needs, all right. So unmet needs, one big obvious area is around funds for legal battles. So about 3 or 4 years ago, the Haredi community raised, did I say? Not legal, yeah, I meant legal, sorry. Raised about £1 million so that they could pay top QCs to represent the partner who is staying in the community. Oh, Queen's Counsel. So, you know, they are kind of really at the top of their game in terms of their position as family lawyers. And so with £1 million behind them, you know, we're conscious that, you know, we're not going to try and raise £1 million. That's not really feasible, but we were trying to find lawyers, family lawyers, who would do pro bono work. And there are some who will meet a couple of times and pro bono to do advisory work, but they won't take on a whole case. So certainly in terms of funds, that is one huge unmet need. And related to that, of course, is affordable accommodation. Mavar can offer, like Footsteps and Hillel, we offer educational scholarships, we offer emergency funds, we offer a variety of other funds, but we really don't have the kind of money to make it possible for people to have a roof over their head for the next year, which is what a lot of them will need. So I'd say that's one of the main things. In terms of challenges, for Mavar itself, it's actually really the fact that we're a faceless organization. So all the other panelists here have their community events, their drop-ins, their meetups, a whole year's worth of opportunities for people to get to know the people behind the charity. Mavar doesn't, because we're discreet and because we offer anonymity. Everything is one-to-one. So although we've got over 100 volunteers, and we are also a volunteer-led organisation, and we've got, fantastic, professional, caring, warm people, actually our members kind of don't really know that. All they know is that they've met one person who's their mentor, unless they've been referred on, and they don't kind of get who we are as an organisation. So for us, that is actually a huge challenge to kind of ground us as human and as real people. So that's one of the things we have to contend with. And what were the other questions? Challenges, unmet needs, and opportunity. I think the opportunity is the fact that we have fantastic goodwill among the wider Jewish community. I get calls all the time, almost daily, from people who have heard about us, heard what we're doing, and want to volunteer. And actually, I could spend my whole time managing the volunteers rather than supporting our members. So the goodwill is there, but we need the funds, really, to enable all the things that need to be done.
Okay, I'm going to try to be concise here because I think there's a lot of overlapping needs. Unmet needs, footsteps, wish list, housing stability, youth services, and connected to that is the need to collaborate more closely with people who are in the community on the fringes of the community. We don't have the capacity to do most of those things. Increased funds for, the legal battles are still an uphill battle. So I would say that are the top unmet needs, and we can talk for a long time about those. In terms of our greatest challenge and opportunity, I think I'll start with being very grateful for the fact that we are where we are today. We've been able to grow to 20 staff. Our budget in 2020 is supposed to reach $4 million. We've been able to specialize our services. So, I have a huge amount of gratitude for having gotten to where we are, and it's thanks to many people in this room. So those are opportunities. The challenge ahead is the breadth versus the depth. We could go out and serve more and more people. We could start new initiatives, or we could continue to focus in on the areas where we are, and managing the organizational capacity to sustain that growth is probably, the biggest challenge. I would say the other biggest opportunity is our community of seekers, leavers, fry-thinking folks, OTDers, right? That is our biggest opportunity. We want all of you engaged in giving back to the organization, and with that comes the fact that there is lived trauma, and supporting folks to figure out how to toggle between being there for your peers, being leaders in the organization, and also not getting consistently pulled back into that trauma is a challenge.
So I think big picture in Israel, the biggest unmet need right now is the fact that I think probably a lot of you know, over the last 5 years there's been a huge push to integrate Haredim into the workforce and educational frameworks in Israel. Hundreds of millions of shekels, both from the government, also from Jewish philanthropy, also from the Israeli business sector, has gone into these projects. Without getting into it here, those programs are not succeeding in the way that had been hoped. At the same time, there's almost no money at all being invested into the community of Yotzim, and who are no longer eligible for those programs once they've left the community, even though they've received the same non-core education and same non-preparation for the workforce as those who are still within the community. So in terms of unmet needs, it's a bigger picture kind of struggle, again, to engage the Israeli government and also the Jewish philanthropic community to start understanding the Yotzim as its own entity in this overall picture. I think in terms of challenges, and actually, let me just tag one more thing onto that, because I have to say that my colleague Irit will be speaking about this a little bit later. Also, the idea that the Yotzim should be recognized in the same way that immigrant populations are in Israel for certain baskets of services and programs. If that's something that sounds interesting to you, you can check out Irit in a little while. But yeah, in terms of challenges and opportunity, the growth of the population. We're looking at a situation where within the next 5 years, we're going to double. Right now, we're serving around 1,900 per year. That's going to double within the next, 4 or 5 years. It's also, all of our services across the board. We're talking about right now we have, 24 beds. We're talking about at least 36 to 48 beds in the next 5 years. We're going to need to open up a center as well in the south of the country, and probably we're looking into opening another emergency shelter in the Tel Aviv area. So we're going to grow a lot in the next 5 years, and the question of how to do that responsibly, both in terms of what you do with that as an organization and how you grow responsibly, and on one hand, grow to meet demand, but do it in a way that doesn't endanger the organization. And I think also in terms of again, on the outside, how we deal with the reining in the government and getting them on board with what we're trying to do here with the population of Yotzim. So the opportunity there is really that in the face of all this, we're really focusing on mobilizing our Yotzim as volunteers in the arena of advocacy and in the arena of sort of like providing different kinds of services within the organization. That's going to be a big focus now, is also current Yotzim, who are participants at this time, also alumni. We want them involved in the organization, and they are becoming more and more so, and that's providing different varieties of services to the organization, but also being extremely active on the advocacy side of things, in short.
Great. We're going to start with audience questions, and I'm going to start actually with a question for you, Avi. And if this is better deferred to Irit's panel later in the day, just tell people to go to that session. But there's a question here about wanting to understand about more how the Ministry of Welfare helps support the Yotzim, and also is this subjected to politics, Haredi politics, etc.? And I'm going to ask you both questions because there's two questions directed towards you. And the question also is, what is the mix of Yotzim in Israel between Yeshivish, Hasidish, Mizrahi, and the different communities that are part of this population?
Okay, in terms of the first question, the Ministry of Welfare support for the community Yotzim is only through the money that they give towards Hillel and also towards Yotzim L'Shinui. So we right now, for example, in 2020, about 25% of our funding will come from the ministry. That's for our centers and some other services we provide that are crisis intervention related. We get matching funds, which is 49% from the ministry, 51% from Hillel. And then for our transitional housing units and for our emergency shelter facility, we get what's called core funding. And that's it comes out to around 75% of we submit expenses and then we get remuneration. The agreement started in 2015, and we had an initial 3-year period, a trial period, where we only got matching funds for certain things. In 2018, we renegotiated that deal based on what happened in the previous 3 years, and now until 2023, the current deal that I just described is what's on the table. After 2023, we'll see what happens. One thing that's interesting now is that we haven't seen any issue with receiving funding based on what's happened, the mess that's going on now in terms of the Israeli elections and the non-government that we have. What we do have is a problem because we already, in the coming year, we're looking to expand some of our services. We were looking to open transitional housing, for example, related to our Haifa center. And we cannot at this time propose any new budgetary items because there's no government and there's nobody to approve them. So that's kind of an issue right there.
Quickly, the breakdown of the population.
I'll tell you the truth, it's hard for me to break that down. What I can tell you, though, which I do know, is this: in terms of the community of Yotzim, in Israel, they say that around from the Litvish community, you have about 12% leaving right now every year. From the Hasidish communities, you have 6%. It's much lower. From the Sephardi communities, you have something like 30% leaving each year. And we don't have time here now, but if I could talk to anybody who wants to understand why that's happening that way.
And quickly to the other panelists, how is your local government supportive or not supportive of your organization? Lani, you want to start?
Not.
Great.
See Mayor de Blasio.
Okay. Linda. Supportive, not supportive?
Well, they don't really know about us, to be honest. But Nachamu, the other thing I meant to flag up earlier is there is a new organisation in London which just found, in fact, this weekend they're doing their launch, and they're called Nachamu, and they are the activist campaigning organisation, and their two main platforms are education and sexual abuse. And so they will have a much higher profile, which is great in a way for us because they will then refer people to us. But they are working hard to work with the government.
In Australia?
Our local government actually gives us funding towards our monthly meetups for our building of our community. Yep.
Great. The issue that came up earlier that you said was one of your desires to build out, which was that your participants had asked for more support in talking to their families, mediating with their families. Can any of you the rest of you say something about anything you offer in that realm of enabling participants to dialogue and mediate with family members who remain in the religious world?
Where's Michael? We had so many questions about this early on. And what we really decided is that, in terms of our vantage point, what's best is to work with individual. So much of the work we do with individuals as they come in is to slow them down. If someone's coming in and it's their 18th birthday, I mean, we get calls from people's 18th birthday. I waited, you know, and they're ready to tell their family and leave. Or someone who's reached a breaking point. Usually when people are parents, they know that the risks are much higher of losing their kids, so we don't have to do as much slowing down then. People are well aware of that, but you know, we ask people what their plan is. And what their vision, what they want to achieve. Do they want a relationship with their family, right? Because if they do, and do they want to thrive and economically? Because if they do, the answer is don't open up about everything right away. Go slowly, figure out what you need to do for yourself and what you want to navigate and how you want to have those conversations with your family. So we do work on family issues, but from the vantage point of the individual largely. And if there was an organization in the community that was like really had a neutral stance and wasn't an outreach organization, a curative organization, I mean, I think in terms of unmet needs, organizations that are in the community, and we'll talk about some of the changes in the Haredi community later today, but I see that as an amazing unmet need in the community to really work with families, because it should be really organizations in the community.
I'll just say, can you hear me? I'll just say very briefly that it's interesting. It's a discussion that literally, you know, in the last couple of days, Irit and I have been talking about this, like, is that our place? Is that not our place? And yeah, we're conflicted. I think as an organization, we're conflicted. So I'm interested to hear more about your experience with that.
Okay, I just want to do a quick time check with Molly. Are we trying to end in 7 minutes? 3:10. Okay, so we could take a few more of these. I'm gonna take this one, even though I thought it was a good closer question, but maybe we'll close with something else. So as this movement builds with these 4 organizations, and there are more people and there's more capacity to identify as Yotzim or being outside, having been in that world and being outside of that world, how could the power, I'm going to riff on this question a little bit, how could this power be harnessed to really work on some of the bigger picture issues like access to education and abuse and other things that seem to be across the system and happening in many places? And what could be the power of this, not just this network, these organizations, but having an identified and large number of people in this universe of Yotzim? And I'll give you just a second. Think about that. Go, Leah.
Okay, so I mean, we're only a small community. So I know Pathways does a lot of sharing on social media of what's going on in the rest of the world. I mean, we've got a massive sexual abuse case going on back home. I don't know if you know of Malka Leifer in Israel, and there are 3 sisters. Can you say one more sentence about that? Sure, okay. Actually, can I just see a raise of hands of who does know about the case? I'm just interested. Okay. So 3 sisters, the Sapa sisters, were sexually abused within the Adas, the Haredi girls' school in Melbourne, by a woman called Malka Leifer, who was from the Gera community in Israel, who was sent from Israel out to Australia, probably sent because she'd abused back in Israel. Well, we know that she had abused in Israel. Now, the night that this story came out in Australia, Mrs. Leifer, the principal, was thrown on a plane with her family and sent back to Israel. So she's been there for the last 10 years, and for the last, I think it's 3 years, or 2 years, she's been 2 years maybe, but behind bars actually. But there have been 63 court hearings with the aim of having her extradited back to Australia. 63. And it's still going. And Dussie Ehrlich, she actually won, she's one of the 3 sisters. She won the biggest case in Australia against a religious institution, sexual abuse within a religious institution. Her 2 other sisters, Nechama or Nicole, she goes by, and Ellie Sapa, haven't done anything against the school, but the 3 sisters are trying to have Leifer back to Australia. Now, I'm optimistic she'll come back, but it's incredibly political. It's actually affecting the relationship between Australia and Israel. And yeah, I don't know how much more you want me to talk about that.
So that's a great example. How could
Yeah, so if you could share this story, I mean...
How could these organizations or this movement of people together be a force to drive justice in that situation?
I mean, from my vantage point, you all know about this now, at least the name. So go out, research it more, and to the point that you're educated about it, post on social media, advocate to your local, government if you're in Israel, right? Like, do what you can as individuals, because the more, for us, I think that there's a huge power of social media to build on the movement building, and that's, from our perspective, there is a movement now that is afoot of people who are connected globally, who understand more about these issues. So I would say that's one thing. I mean, the other piece is that us as organizations need to share more with each other. We have a WhatsApp group. We're meeting tomorrow. Aliza's facilitating. She can plug more about that. But, I think that sharing best practices, there are a number of organizations out here that are in the room today. There are some that couldn't join us at this convening, but we need to be able to brainstorm together and ask each other for help and advice.
I guess I'll just really quickly say, I think that on some level, none of us know, right? Like, what can come of this kind of gathering, right? But that's the point. In other words, it hasn't happened before. Here we all are in the same room, right? And we'll have time over the rest of the day, some of us also tomorrow. And what that does is it creates moments of opportunity, moments where we can figure out what it means and where it can go and what partnerships are possible, what awareness can be built, what people want to do, can do, should do, will do together. So just on the simple level of this creates potential.
And I was just going to quickly say that the original title, I think, of this didn't include the word network. I think it was the word, what was the word you used? Movement, about the movement building. And I said to Aliza, well, actually, Mavar is, because we're not campaigning, because we don't want to be seen, and we don't want to be missionary, it's important that we're not a missionary organization. I didn't want there to be, from our perspective, part of a movement, but I do really want to be part of a network. And I think, as you say, the value of sharing, etc. But the role of Nachamu, which is why it's great, because we've got these different agencies within each country, their job is to do that. And they have within their team someone from the Quilliam Foundation. You probably don't know. And Quilliam in Britain is an organization that looks at anti-extremism across all religions. And they're very vocal and active, and they can do their bit. So if everyone's doing their bit and we're all talking, I think we will get there.
Great. I'm going to put out a question that has a little bit of pushback in it, because that's, that'll make this a little more interesting. One of our questions is that in light of the problem in the ultra-Orthodox world, which is a lack of respect, and this is the questioner's perspective, lack of respect for self-expression and self-determination, do you feel like it's part of our responsibility to help people leave and not just offer them the option if they want to? That there should be something a little more proactive in the helping people to self-determine versus just passively letting people define their paths? I want to hear from all of you, or anyone who wants to respond to that.
You want to go? We've thought a lot about this. For us, the more and more role models of success we could put out there for individuals who have had the thought that they could make something new of their lives and then did and have succeeded in doing so, the more that will give people, and like with the power of social media, the more that will give people who might have that sense that they don't belong an understanding that there could be something different for them. So that is, for us, it's really about all of you who are Yotzim, who are people who have left, right? Being role models of success out there. And that's not that we don't need to do that work directly as an organization, but that we could hold you up and you do that work. So I'm going to plug the storytelling booth, actually. That's upstairs on 4, downstairs on 4. because that is what the point of that is. So that's what we got.
I think
Go ahead.
I think I really agree with Lani on this in a deep way. It's interesting, as an organization, as I said, we don't do outreach, and there's a question of what that means, what the line is. You know, someone calls to the hotline, you know, so obviously there's a conversation that happens there. Is that doing outreach? Is that not doing outreach? That's a question. But I think that the idea of, you know, one of the things that I believe in, that we believe as an organization, that will change from the ground up what's going on in the Haredi community in terms of things like education or workforce development, is Yotzim who succeed and are out there in the world succeeding. And that the Haredi community in Israel knows they have a problem. They know people are leaving, right? And they're avoiding dealing with the problem. And the more Yotzim who succeed and succeed publicly, the more they're going to have to deal with their problem. The more they're going to have to deal with the fact that they do have to provide certain core education, because their own people want those things, because they don't want to live in a community where a full 45% of the families are under the poverty line, and a full 67% of the children are under the poverty line because of the birth rate, right? They don't want to live in a community where 51% of men of adult age are working and only 12% have the equivalence of a high school education, right? You know, in terms of our intake, those are some of the main factors that bring people towards Hillel, is that they want something better. And again, the more and more Yotzim who are out there presenting, then the more that'll happen from the ground up.
I was just going to quickly say that I completely agree. We gave a lot of thought to this about how proactive we are. And the reason that I concur with what's just been said is my firm belief was that this issue is an issue for the Jewish population of Britain as a whole. I feel we have a responsibility to support people who need self-determination. I don't need to explain, obviously, what that is. And because it's a responsibility of the wider Jewish community, if we were seen to be more proactive, more outreach, I would lose more than half of them, because they ask me all the time, are you encouraging people to leave? Is that what you're doing? And I would lose them, and I don't want to lose them. I want their support. So that's why we don't.
I mean, a key difference between Hillel and Footsteps, Hillel and Footsteps compared to Mavar and Pathways, is that your brands are known within your community, within the Frum communities. Our brands are less, well, I can't speak but from what you say. Our brand is not known yet in the Frum community enough. We're becoming pretty well known in the everyday community, but not so. We do need to do more outreach to get our name out there, but are we out there to pull people away? No, not in the slightest. Actually, I touched on before, I love to try and talk to people within the ultra-Frum community. I like being incognito and chatting to them about, you know, what do you do when somebody is questioning? What do you do? Where do they go? And they say, well, you know, they just go, they do the thing. Well, don't you feel that they need somewhere to go, to, you know, sense of community? And that's what we're there for. We're that mattress for them to fall on. And they start to see the benefit of who Pathways is and what we do. And I think that for me is a good way of doing outreach.
I just want to add one quick thing. Yes, Footsteps and Hillel's names are known, but is our brand understood is a really different question. And so that like boogeyman under the bed issue is big for both organizations. If anyone watched the documentary One of Us on Netflix, you know, when you saw that scene of the court transcripts, do you go to Footsteps? Dun, dun, dun. That is real, okay? Right? The myths that we wrap people in bacon and force people into an orgy are real. Those are real myths that exist that do not happen, right? The myths that then seep into the broader progressive Jewish community aren't you really pulling people out? That's a myth, all right? So there's a lot of work we all have to do on myth busting.
Great. We have 4 minutes to close, so I'm giving each of you 1 minute. It's going to be super quick. And you are going to say, the year is 2010. We are at our not at the next convening, but we're at the 2010 convening, bringing everyone back together. I'm sorry, 2030. My math was 2030, excuse me. It's 2030. We are 10 years out from this convening. Share one amazing thing that has happened either for your organization or for this network in the last decade. Anyone can start.
I guess the one amazing thing would be exactly what we just said, that everyone in the ultra-Orthodox community has heard of Mavar. If we're known, we can do the work. It's as simple as that. But I did just want to share, may I, a couple of quotes. I mean, maybe you've heard these, but I found them kind of interesting. And they're Victorian. John Ruskin, this was something that really motivated me when I started. John Ruskin said, through our ability to express ourselves, we become fully human. And I found that a very motivating thing when I first started. But George Bernard Shaw also, I liked his quote. He said, life isn't about finding yourself. Life is about creating yourself. And I feel if we can do that by 2030, we'll have done a good job.
It's an interesting question. In terms of the organization, I'd like to see, a time when Hillel was reaching all the Yotzim in Israel. In other words, where we were serving the community fully, providing not just the range of services that we provide now, but providing services that come from the place of what Yotzim themselves let us know they need and what develops over time. In terms of this network of people here, I guess I would wish the same thing on all the other organizations, that we all reach people and grow apace with the need for our services, and that we're responsible to what that means, both in terms of on the organizational level and on the world level. It's a big question you asked, so I'm giving a big answer because I don't know if I have a very specific one.
I'm going to be totally idealistic and say that I would love a future where the work that our organisation does is really well understood within the ultra-frum community, that we're not there to pull anyone away, but to create a safe space for questioning and a sense of community that will help their sons and daughters or help their parents. The frum communities may not like that we need to exist. They might not like the fact that people do not choose from life as their truth, but I would love there to be some compassion for those that do in fact leave, and some appreciation or gratitude that there is a mob that's going to help them.
Lani? The big dream?
This is a really big question. My mind went to exactly where Avi's mind went. I mean, for I think all of us, our vision is to have a sense that anyone who wants to self-individuate and grows up in a community that does not allow for that, in the insular religious community, in the ultra-Orthodox community specifically, has the ability to do so, supported with access to the resources, and that and that they don't have to give up the relationships that are so important to them in their life to do so. I mean, that's all of our dreams, really. So.
And that at some point there's no need for us.
Correct.
So thank you, all four of you, Lani and Linda and Leah and Avi, and particularly thank you for coming from miles and miles away and sitting on long airplane rides to make this an international gathering. And thank you, everybody, for listening and participating.